Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to learn about the part 4 of our first unit. Our first unit, Introduction to Policy Debate. Today's part 4, the negative positions. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to summarize the role of the negative team. You should be able to analyze the roles of the speeches in the negative team. You should be able to give examples of common evidence violations. Let's begin in Roman numeral 11. The negative's job, the duty of the negative team, is to negate the resolution. If at any point they stop negating the resolution, they deserve to lose the debate. Now that seems like a really obvious thing, particularly since we said the job of the affirmative is to affirm the resolution, but you'd be surprised how often the negative actually cedes that position and stops negating the the resolution. They just think of themselves as against the affirmative, but that's actually not the way that resolutional debate works. If they propose a topical counterplan, for instance, I'm convinced that both teams are then affirming the resolution, and the negative deserves to lose the debate. Now, I'll also say that, like we have talked, that there's very few rules in debate. Some judges disagree with that position and think that topical counterplans are acceptable. I quite disagree, because that's not the way resolutional debate works, but, you know, judges do what they do. Let's focus in on the status quo. So the negative typically builds their positions around a defense of the status quo. The status quo is the existing state of affairs, especially regarding social or political issues. The negative has some other options, though, besides backing up the status quo. They might concede that the status quo is less than ideal, but that the affirmative's plan will not actually fix the problem. They might claim that the affirmative's plan would create some disadvantageous situation that would be worse than the status quo, or they might propose an alternate way of solving the problem, some kind of a counterplan that's non-topical but otherwise advantageous. Subpoint D. The negative generally would take two types of arguments, both an on-case argument and an off-case argument. Let's begin with the on-case argument. They respond to specific claims the affirmative makes about the status quo or the merits of the plan. These are oftentimes referred to as observations or contentions or advantages. They're things that happen if the plan is passed. Then there's off-case arguments, which make new claims about the problems of the affirmative plan. These might include things like topicality or disadvantages or counterplans. They don't specifically respond to some claim that the affirmative makes. They're going off the case and talking about things that would happen as a result of the affirmative's proposals. In a lot of ways, the negative team is debate's policeman. The negative team has the duty to to hold the affirmative team to the resolution, and they're the ones that would call the foul if the affirmative team goes off base with it. So if the affirmative advocates a non-topical plan, the negative's job is to call them on it. If the affirmative doesn't present a prima facie case, then the negative must call them on it. In a lot of ways, the job of the negative team is to hold the affirmative team accountable to the concept of resolutional or even fair policy debate. The negative also has a little bit of advantage of some theory. The affirmative needs to basically win every stock issue to win the round, whereas the negative team has to only win one. Now, as we discussed previously, there's nothing magical about stock issues. It's not like these are the rules of debate, because again, debate has very few rules. But because policy debate proposes a policy has to show there's some reason why there should be a change and that they can do something about it, and that it's a good idea to do so. Those are just the way that policy making works in real life, and policy debate is about the way that policy making works. So if there's any reason why some of those things aren't true, if it's actually not that bad of a situation, or that changing it would make it worse, or that changing the situation actually wouldn't result in a positive or solving idea at all, then we would say that they've lost some stock issue. But in a policy making decision, all of these are reasons why a judge would not vote affirmative. Let's move to Roman numeral number 12. Now here I want to talk about what the negative speaker positions are. And as we talked about before, debate positions are kind of like positions in basketball. There's not really a rule that says that somebody has to go do a particular thing at a particular time, but debate has seemed to evolve that they work better when people do their things in the order that it's supposed to be done in. So let's talk about the first negative constructive. Remember, there's 2 positions on a negative team, a first negative and a second negative. Just like in the affirmative team, there's a first affirmative and a second affirmative. The negative has the same thing, where there's two people on there. And there's constructives and rebuttals. In constructives, you construct arguments. In rebuttals, you rebut the other side's answers to your arguments or rebut their arguments as well. So the first negative constructive is the first time the negative team is going up and issuing a speech in the round. The negative team has talked in a cross-examination, which we'll talk more about later, but it's not a speech and it doesn't flow, and they're there to ask clarifying questions or to set up future arguments. But the first negative constructive is the first time the negative team is actually making arguments which will appear as judgment arguments in the round. So the first thing they should do is go explain the neg's position of the round. This shouldn't take very long, but they should get up and explain the negative story and what the negative team is going to try to assert. It shouldn't take long, 10 seconds or so, but it should give like a speaking style judge some understanding of where the rest of the round is going to go. We'll talk more about speaking styles or judging styles later in the semester. They should also introduce the major negative arguments of the round. Should all be introduced in the 1NC. They'll be continuing to develop the rest of the debate, but they should introduce the major negative arguments of the round. And these might include three significant kinds of arguments. The first one is a topicality argument. You'll also hear this referred to as T, and it asserts that the affirmative is proposing something that isn't tied to the resolution. If you're going to run a T argument, you should do it first. You should do it really up early in the 1NC, because topicality is an a priori issue and it must take precedent of the round. You have to determine if the affirmative team is topical really before you can kind of get anywhere else. It's a priori issue. It should be thrown up front. Now, there's not against the rules to have this in a second negative constructive. It's a little awkward there because the negative team has been arguing here with oh yes, and they're not resolution. Again, it's not illegal to appear in the 2NC, but it works best when it's in the 1NC. I have seen topicality successfully argued in the 2NC. Because at first everybody thought the affirmative was a topical, on its face of it, this is a topical plan. But as the round continued to go on, the second affirmative was saying some things, and cross-examination was leading the negative team to think actually the way the AF is running this plan, it's not a topical plan. So I have seen it successfully run in the 2NC, but let's put it up in the 1NC. That's really where it's best served. The 1NC might also offer some disadvantages. Now, disadvantages, or disads, or DAs, all three of those terms are interchangeable. They say that voting affirmative would produce some downside, some disadvantageous situation. And the 1NC might run a disadvantage that's specific to the affirmative plan. Something that, specifically, they're running this and a bad thing will happen out of it. And they build a DA argument based specifically about what's going on in the affirmative, based on what the affirmative said. These are very effective when they're built specifically for a 1AC. And it's we have seen this, and that's where it's going to be going for. More commonly, a 1NC was going to run a generic DA, something that's kind of just happens in a lot of rounds. And when I was debating, in the 90s, generic disads were seen as kind of lowbrow. It's one of those oh, you're going to run this every round. That's no longer the case. And now you're basically expected to roll out some kind of a generic DA kind of in every round. And it's no longer considered trash debate to do so. The 1NC might also offer a counterplan. Now, a counterplan is a non-resolutional way to achieve the affirmative's advantages. So the 1NC might offer some way to say that an advantage, the affirmative advantages would be really good things, but there's a better way to achieve them than what the affirmative proposes. Now, earlier I said that counterplans should be non-resolutional, and I believe that's true. They should be non-resolutional. Otherwise, both teams are telling me to affirm the resolution. There are some judges and certainly some coaches that disagree with me on that, and it's a somewhat risky position to run, but I think if you are a neg, you should be non-topical, and if you are an affirmative and your negative team runs a topical counterplan, I think it's totally a fair argument to say, hey, judge, both teams are telling you to affirm the resolution. So we're getting into debate theory, and it's exciting and fun, and I love talking about it, but we're into the jello land where you put down a foot and it's not going to stand. Subpoint B. Now, the second negative constructive is the second time the negative team is going to go up and make arguments of the case. This is a different kid in the round, right? This is a different debater is the 2N, and their first speech is the second negative constructive. And likewise, this is a constructive speech, and the negative can continue to construct new arguments. There are some camps of debate that says you shouldn't have anything new in the 2, and you should introduce all the major rounds, all the major arguments in the 1NC. That's actually not the way that we can understand a constructive, where you can continue to construct arguments, but that is a position that some people will hold. They're oh no, the 2NC's job is to extend what was put up in the 1NC. So that argument is out there. I think we can say that it's called a constructive. You can continue to construct arguments for it. So their job here is to reassert and to further develop the negative strategy. They don't need to answer everything that 2AC said. So the second affirmative is going to answer the 1NC, the 2AC is going to come up and try to answer everything they say, and a 2NC doesn't need to go answer everything that the 1NC does, the 2AC does. It's actually not their job is to go totally answer the 2AC. They do need to respond to some major counterattacks. So if the second affirmative has gone up and made some serious holes in the 1N's case, then the 2N should get up there and patch those holes up. That's something they should do. They should address any new affirmative arguments. It used to be fairly common that a second affirmative would roll out like a new advantage 3, and they would roll it out that was new. That's less common than it used to be, but if that happens, then the 2NC needs to address those new arguments, and they should continue to attack the affirmative, but specifically focus on the case. To say that in observation 1, the affirmative said blah, blah, blah. We have 3 answers to that, and it is yada yada, 2 yada yada, 3 yada yada, whatever it is. They should attack the affirmative's case as they go down. The 2NC is the first speech, what's known as the negative block. The strange thing about debate, and you go look up the chart of what, the different, speeches on there, you'll realize that there's a moment in the debate where the negative team gets back-to-back speeches. It's separated by a cross-examination, but cross-examinations are not speeches. There's this moment where there's back-to-back speeches. It's the second negative constructive, and then before you know it, you're down to the first negative rebuttal, and those two things happen back-to-back. This is referred to in debate as the negative block. It's a big block of time. It's a 13-minute block of time where the negative team gets to speak without interruption from the affirmative. I mean, there's a cross-examination type, but they don't get to throw any arguments up there. So we say that you can split the block, which means that the 2NC can, propose new arguments. They can answer the major holes of the 2AC, but they don't need to go answer everything because the first negative is going to get a chance to go rebut the major things that the 2AC has thrown up there. So split the arguments. Divide your arguments between the 2NC and the 1NR to do so. Typical second negative constructive arguments would point out any drops, anything that the affirmative didn't answer from the 1NC, anything that the 1NC arguments went uncontested by the 2AC. Arguments are considered dropped arguments if they don't mention it at all, and they might be considered arguments that are conceded by the affirmative. The 2NC should also address things, the phrase we say is case in order, and that's where they're going to take the evidence put up by the first affirmative, and they're going to go through and say, okay, here's the evidence, here's the case they have laid out, here's the problems with the case. They should go with case in order. The strongest thing that a second negative constructive can do to win a round is do a line-by-line critique of the first affirmative constructive. Say, in observation 1, they say this, we have 3 answers to it, blah, 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 blah. In advantage 1, we say, they have 3 advantage cards for it, we're going to take the first one, and we think that here's our 2 answers to their first part of advantage 1, and here's their second part. They said this, we have 2 answers to it here. Answer number 1, answer number 2. In advantage 1, they said this, we have 2 answers to that. Advantage 1, advantage 2. That is a very strong position for a 2NC to go take to address case in order. And you should use the argumentation formula. We have introduced the argumentation formula earlier. Let's just refresh our minds to it. It says the first thing is, the link, the claim, the evidence, and the warrant. So they basically say, okay, they said so-and-so, we say so-and-so, here's our evidence, here's the warrant for it. Or they say so-and-so, we say so-and-so, and you give the warrant, and then you gump into the explanation for it. The argumentation formula is super important. It might seem kind of overwhelming for a novice new to the game. This will make more sense once you see the pieces fall in place and around, but it has the claim, the evidence, the warrant. What are you trying to prove? How are you trying to prove it? And then show how the evidence proves the claim to do so. This should take up most of the time in the 2NC. You put a lot of red ink on that flow. Give the first affirmative a lot to do. And that takes us to the next speech of the negative block, which is the 1NR. I like to think of this as the door slammer speech. In rebuttals, please do not reread evidence. Do not reread evidence. If you have read evidence in the round, it is submitted to the round. And unless, there is some reason why the other team is misconstruing the evidence, you don't need to reread evidence. You can say, refer back to the Wahlberg and 23 card, and you can, look at that. And you will be sharing this evidence with other teams, with the judges available to look at the evidence as well. You do not need to reread evidence. You can refer back to it. Please cross-apply the Wahlberg and 23 card, but don't reread evidence. It is okay to read new evidence as long as you're not making a new argument. So you can develop the disad that you had laid out earlier, And you could say, well, the negative team or the affirmative team denies our evidence on so-and-so. But the thing is, there's not just that one author. We have a plethora of authors, and this one explains it in this way. Or I have a card which post-dates their card. My card is more recent. The situation has changed. You can read new evidence in rebuttals, but you can't make a new argument. You can't roll out a brand new topicality argument in rebuttals. You can't roll out a brand new disadvantage argument in rebuttals. All of those things need to be established. They need to be constructed in the constructive speeches. You can offer new answers to arguments, but you can't roll out a brand new argument in a rebuttal. You should be rebutting the arguments which are already being made up there. So it's okay to read new evidence as long as you're not adding a new argument to it. In the 1NR, the first rebuttal speech of the negative team, you might quietly drop any arguments that you don't have a chance at winning. So topicality, you threw it out there, you wanted to see if it works, you think that maybe they were untopical. As they were explaining it, you're like, you know what, I don't really have a path to winning this topicality argument. Just don't mention it. Just drop it. Let the argument go. There's no reason to try to ride a dying horse on there. Any disadvantages or potentially a counterplan, depending on how you set up the counterplan, case side arguments you don't have a chance of winning, it's okay to just let those go. While the affirmative team can't drop any negative arguments, the negative team can. Remember, the affirmative team always has to show a prima facie argument, which carries the burden of proof, and that shows that they win all of the stock issues, because stock issues aren't some magical thing. They're just how policy is made. And the affirmative team always has the burden of proof to show that the policy is a good idea and will work and will solve the problems that exist. The negative team doesn't have to win all of those arguments, and they can say, you know, to themselves, we proposed a counterplan. Counterplan isn't going to work. Stop talking about the counterplan. We're going to focus in on the disadvantages. Depending on how you run the counterplan, sometimes that's tricky to do. But you could certainly drop a DA. You could certainly drop a topicality argument if it's not a winning thing. Again, no new arguments and rebuttals. You may not introduce new arguments, no disadvantages, for instance. You are permitted to make new responses to answers given in the 2AC. In practice, this distinction is often lost on people who are new to the game. So, like, in practice, sometimes you don't actually know what the arguments are that you're running up there, particularly in your first few novice appearances. To do so, it's often lost on low experienced teams or low experienced judges to do so. So the 2NR, the second negative rebuttal, which we're going to talk about next, should be ready to defend it if you're accused of running new arguments. Let's not run new arguments and rebuttals. That's the best way to do it. The best practice is to carefully signpost your responses and use the argumentation formula. In Advantage 2, subpoint C, the second affirmative constructive responded to our argument X by saying Y. I have two responses to their answer. If you say that, then it's very clear you're not introducing new arguments in the round. You're just putting up new responses to arguments that already exist, which is fair. There's rebuttals. You're allowed to rebut other arguments. If you lay out those signposts along the way, then that's probably going to work out best for you. Now, let's talk about subpoint D, the second negative rebuttal. This is the last chance of the negative team to reassert the negative position. This is like the last moment it's going to happen. Why must the resolution be negated? This is the job that you got to go settle out there. And, you know, like the 1NR, you have some issue selection here. You get a chance to focus on arguments that you are winning and quietly drop any arguments that you don't have a chance at winning. If you are not going to win that argument, let's not just throw it into the judge's face on that. You can quietly drop arguments along the way. I don't know that you need to say, you know what, we're not losing, we're not winning on our topicality argument, we're going to drop it. Like, I don't know what the advantage is to saying that. It keeps a tidy flow maybe, but if you just don't bring up topicality anymore, that's fine too. So focus on the arguments you're winning and quietly drop any arguments you don't have a chance at winning. Instead, focus on summing up the reasons why the judge cannot accept the affirmative proposal. You cannot adopt the resolution. This is difficult sometimes, particularly early in your debate career, to realize what arguments you're winning and which ones give the affirmative some kind of a rhetorical advantage. Also, the second negative rebuttal needs to rip open the holes. If you have found some flaw in the plan or the case proposed by the affirmative, a good 2NR will respectfully but definitely point out the flaws in the 1AR. They'll make it very difficult for the 2AR to overcome these problems. If the first affirmative rebuttal drops some argument, second negative rebuttalist, it is your job to shout that from the rooftops. And please don't actually climb on the roof and shout. But you need to point that out. The first affirmative rebuttal did not even discuss our disadvantage Judge, if they're not going to talk about this, then it's as good as conceded, and you need to flow that as a negative argument. The 2NR absolutely needs to say that. A good 2NR will respectfully point out flaws in the first affirmative rebuttal and make it very difficult for the second affirmative rebuttalist to get up there and overcome those problems. The 2AR, if there was a drop in the 1AR, the 2AR, it needs to have an awkward situation there. So the best practice is, again, to carefully signpost your arguments and use the argumentation formula. In Advantage 2, subpoint C, the 1AR responded to our argument X by saying Y. I have two responses to their answer. It's the same way that the first negative rebuttalist should work. The second negative rebuttalist should work the same thing. Put clear signposts up. It's obvious you're not introducing new arguments, that you are introducing new responses to it. Show that it's a bad idea to vote affirmative and the negative is better. A really good 2NR gives the last segment, the last 20 seconds or so of a 2NR, and to tell the story of the negative team. It's your last chance to go speak to the judge of the negative team and to just go up there and say, this is why you can't vote affirmative. Like, all of these things need to have a negative ballot. Spend the last little bottom section of it to go be the salesperson of your piece. Let's move to Roman numeral number 13. Here, we're going to shift gears. We're going to talk about evidence violations. This isn't specifically a job of the negative team. Both teams will be held to this. And let's talk about what it means when somebody is violating some negative or some, evidentiary standard. Here, I'm going to introduce a few of them. The first one, subpoint A, is distortion. Now, this is when the textual evidence, when the actual text of the evidence card itself contains added words or deleted words that significantly alter the conclusion of the author. For instance, if the sentence has the word not in it and you just omit the word not, or you stick it in when it isn't there, that's bad. Or failure to bracket off any added words, like maybe the article is going to say, at the situation, he said something, and you might want to clarify who is the he. At the situation, Professor Johnson said blah, blah, blah. Bracketed words to indicate that there's some kind of like a substitution for a pronoun in there. We don't love it in debate, but because evidence isn't written for debate rounds, sometimes it happens. But you got to clearly indicate that this is some kind of like you're clarifying a missing pronoun or an unclear antecedent or something. We don't really love to see it in debate. But when it happens, it needs to be really clear that you're not just adding new words into there. That would be a distortion violation. Some reason why you have changed the text. This is a very risky move. I don't want to see any of our teams ever doing it. It's actually pretty rare. I don't think in all of my time in debate experience, I don't think I've ever seen it. I don't think I've ever seen somebody actually distorting evidence. It's actually fairly rare to do because it's extremely risky. Please don't do it. Not only is it bad for your round, and not only bad for like your eternal soul to be a liar. Maybe that's actually worse than the next part of the sentence I was going to say. It's bad for our team. It is bad for our team. It's also bad for your eternal soul. Please don't do that. Subpoint B. A bigger challenge is what known in debate as non-existent evidence. And non-existent evidence means one or more of the following things has happened. First, the debater is citing evidence, but it's unable to provide the original source or copy of the relevant pages when it's requested. You'll see our evidence has a URL on it. That's things that have been taken from the internet. And a person can go and click that link or put that link into a browser and go find out this was an actual source for it. If that is not a valid link, then we might presume that that's non-existent evidence. This is something that's been totally falsified. If work comes from something in print, and back in my day, back when I debated, we often had print evidence. It was something that we found in an actual newspaper. Newspapers were like websites, except they took all of the words and somebody wrote it out on a thinly sliced piece of tree. That was a newspaper. Anyway, we used to often have print evidence on there. And we would say that if you can't actually show me where that is in print, if you don't actually have a real copy of it, then maybe we presume it's not existent evidence. This might have been edited or typed out there. There is also a practice, this is less common than it used to be, but there's also a practice where debate teams buy source books. There are professional researchers who go and they cut evidence and they have books of evidence on it. And teams might buy one of these from a professional researcher on it. And in those cases, they have a variety of names. Some of my favorite names, they have it was called Squirrel Killers. And it was about like finding these squirrely little oddball cases, and the editors would put together things like specifically for these squirrely cases. Anyway, whatever. In those cases, we often don't have links for them, and we don't have the original print or an image of the original print. The Kansas State High School Activities Association actually allows those to exist. You just need to indicate, we got this from Squirrel Killers. Our team doesn't really have a lot of case books anymore. Maybe some individual debaters find them. It's not all that common of a practice. The internet era has really cut down on case books. Anyway, so that's one thing. You don't have some original copy or a way to find the original copy of it. That would be, we consider that technically that's non-existent evidence. I can't prove that it wasn't just made up. Or non-existent evidence might include things like the original source doesn't contain the evidence cited. So, I have clicked the link on the site, and when I read that article, the quoted part doesn't come from that article. Now, maybe it was just the wrong link, and it was a mistake to do so, and it's an honest mistake, and we will charitably say that if it's an honest mistake, it's an honest mistake. However, you still need to prove citation for it, and even if it is an honest mistake, you still can't use it. You still can't use it in a round. We would consider that non-existent evidence when I've gone and clicked that link and read that website, and the thing that it says doesn't actually say that. We might also say non-existent evidence is the evidence is paraphrased, but lacks the original source to verify the accuracy of the paraphrasing. Now, to this, I want to parenthetically say, please don't do any paraphrasing. No good is going to come out of that in a debate round. But I suppose it's possible that a team that we face is going to go paraphrase evidence, and we don't have the original source to show what the paraphrasing is. Paraphrasing is not actually that common in policy debate, and you're getting into the Jello land when you're doing that. It's hard to establish anything firm there. Or we might consider something that the debater is in possession of the original source, but won't provide it. So oh yes, well I got that from a book. Okay, I'd like to see the book, please. No, it's in my bag, and I don't want to give it to you. For whatever reason, they decline to show it, then we would consider that non-existent evidence. These things are fairly rare. Again, most people debate on the up and up, and there's not a lot of challenges to that. I guess the biggest evidence violation that is common would be the non-existent evidence of they're not showing something with a correct URL or a print source, or they're not claiming it's out of Squirrel Killers. Those are kind of common evidentiary violations. But overall, evidentiary violations are not super common in most rounds. They do happen. I don't want to make it... It's not like distortion, which I don't have any experience with. Non-existent evidence... It does happen, not all that often. A bigger issue is our subpoint C, what's known as card clipping. Now here, this happens all the time, and it's a major problem that, frankly, as a coach, I have a real hard time fixing in the rounds I judge. Sometimes in the teams that I've coached, this has been kind of hard to do. Is what happens with clipping is when the debater claims to have read the complete text of a highlighted or underlined piece of evidence, when in fact the debater has skipped or omitted part of the evidence. So remember, when we submit a card to a round, we have shared it with the other people in the room. Usually this happens electronically. They put it up on a website, everybody can pull it down again, and the judge might be looking at it, the other team might be looking at it, whatever. And certain parts are highlighted, right? Because evidence isn't written to be used in debate rounds. We got to kind of cut out some words. You're not changing the intent of the piece, but you're trimming it up to go use it rhetorically. And maybe you have highlighted more things than you have actually said out loud. Well, that's known as clipping. You are misrepresenting what you have introduced to the debate. Because debate happens orally. It's the words we say. The print words should back up the things we say. And if we are misrepresenting, like, oh, yes, the highlighting, we read the highlights, and then you didn't actually read the highlights, that's known as card clipping. And this is the most common form of evidence violation in modern debate. If you're not going to read the whole indicated card, the part that we've highlighted, right, you need to indicate to your opponent and judge where you stop reading it. And the phrase you'll hear is all the time, and mark the card at Thompson or something like that, right? The best practice, what I actually like to see in rounds is to predetermine where you are going to cut the card and highlight it accordingly, and don't highlight the parts that you're not going to read. But just stopping reading the highlighted parts before you get all the way to the end, that's a problem. It's known as card clipping, and you're misrepresenting to your opponent and to your judge how much evidence you're submitting into the round. And the last evidence violation we're going to discuss here is what's known as a straw argument. This is a position or argumentative claim introduced by an author for the purpose of refuting, discrediting, or characterizing it. So they might say something like, one might say that bearded teachers are less intelligent than non-bearded teachers. However, the evidence shows the contrary, that bearded teachers are not only more intelligent, they're better looking and tell funnier jokes. And an example of a straw argument might mean when a debater goes and cuts out part of that line that reads something like, bearded teachers are less intelligent than non-bearded teachers. And they don't show what the rest of the card is. This is also like a distortion part. You have selectively edited parts out. Its reliance on a straw argument happens in a debate round when a debater asserts incorrectly that the author supports or endorses a straw argument as his or her own position. What happens is they have introduced a position to argue against it, and the debater just says, they're like, oh yes, this author is introducing this argument. And they don't talk about like the rest of it is counteracting this straw man they're burning down. A debater who acknowledges using a straw argument verbally first, read in the round, would not be misrepresenting the evidence. It is okay to say, like, some people say that bearded teachers are less intelligent. However, that's not true, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's okay to introduce the first part of the argument if you're going to refute it there. If the evidence says it, like, that is okay to submit the entire thing. However, if the debater fails to acknowledge the use of a straw argument and his or her opponent questions the use of that straw argument, then the debater has committed an evidence violation and they are misusing evidence in a way. Now, straw arguments honestly are more likely to come up in other types of debate than policy debate. We're more likely to see them in some of the forensic season debates than we see in policy, but it is possible to appear there as well. Okay, so in this video lesson, we had three objectives: to summarize the role of the negative team, and it is to negate the resolution, right? And they have a lot of paths to doing so. Whether or not they're going to defend the status quo, whether or not they're going to show a counterplan, whether or not they're going to show disadvantages to voting affirmative, but they negate the resolution. However, so that's the role of the negative team. And we gave some analysis of the roles of the speeches of the negative team. We talk about the role of the 1NC is to go propose the major arguments of the round. We talk about the job of the 2NC, the second negative constructive, is to go and bolster the major things of the 1NC, but also to handle case in order. And then we've talked about the job of the 1NR, the first negative rebuttal, is to go and put on multiple responses to what the second affirmative had said to their responses, and basically the job of the 1NR is to take the 1NC and answer the answers to it, right? And we talked about the 2NR is to go be the sum up and salesperson of the round, to say, like, here's the major parts we're winning, and to go, sell of why the judge should vote negative instead of affirmative to do so. And then we gave some examples of common evidence violations. We talked about distortion, non-existent evidence, the more common problem of evidence clipping, and the, again, not very common, but could have an example of a straw argument as evidentiary violations. All of these pieces are going to make far more sense once we, see some live pitching and we get into what a round actually might look like. I can't wait to tell you more about that. It's going to be awesome. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.